Elly De La Cruz needs protection from the Rule 5 draft, that is. We will dive into who else the Reds must add to the 40-man roster so as to keep them protected too. We will also look at a few options that the Reds can add to their Major League roster to improve next year's lineup. That's all coming up on today's Locked On Reds.
You are Locked On Reds, your daily Cincinnati Reds podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Reds. Thanks for making Locked On Reds your first listen of the day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and we are free and available on all podcasting platforms. I'm your host, Stephen Offenbaker, alongside Jeff Carr. Jeff and I both have a passion for baseball. We have a passion for the Cincinnati Reds, and we have taken that passion and we have turned it into information for you. On today's podcast, it is Rule 5 time. And while that might not sound exciting, it is a big deal because that's how the Reds are going to protect a bunch of young studs from being scooped up by other teams. Jeff and I are going to discuss who the Reds should protect. And a little bit later this week, we'll tell you how they're going to do it. There are also a couple of former Reds that were traded away at the deadline in 2022 that could see a reunion with the team via free agency. We will talk about who could make a return to the Queen City. Also, Major League Baseball announced the details for the very first draft lottery, and we are going to break it down and have you covered on this whole new process being rolled out by Major League Baseball. But Jeff, I think the most important place to start with today's conversation is going to be the Rule 5 draft and who the Reds need to protect in order to keep other teams from scooping them up. And there's a couple names, like, listen, there's some no-brainer names on this list. But when we first started looking at this list and looking at moves the Reds were going to have to make, absolutely have to make, it was surprising to me, a few of the names on this list, because it just didn't seem like in my head that a few of these guys have been around long enough to need Rule 5 protection.
And that's where I want to start real quick, Steve, is because when you say Rule 5 draft and protect them from that, basically the Rule 5 draft was created so the teams just couldn't hoard a bunch of prospects. That's the big picture of it and the reason that we all need to understand it. And when it comes to Rule 5 protection, a prospect, because they do not have to be a Major League player. In fact, most of these guys aren't. In fact, all of them aren't. But a prospect that is 18 years old when he signed his first contract must be added to the 40-man roster 4 years from his signing year. And then if you're 19 years or older, or sorry, 5 years, I'm getting this all mixed up. 18 years old, 5 years from your signing year. And then if you're 19 years old or older when you sign your first rookie deal, you must be on the 40-man roster within 4 years of signing your deal. So to say all that, these are the reasons why these guys are on this list, because the first one, and I mentioned him already in the cold open, was Elly De La Cruz. And people are thinking, well, gosh, he's not even that old, but it has nothing to do with how old he is. It's just when he first signed. He signed as an 18-year-old. It's now time for him to be on the 40-man roster so the Reds can protect him. And like you said, he leads a group of very obvious guys. I think there's 4, and I think we would both agree that there are 4 guys who absolutely, unequivocally will be added to the 40-man roster to be protected from the Rule 5 draft, and he leads that group.
Yeah, and I'll tell you this, I like the way the stars are aligning on this a little bit also, Jeff. You know, Elly is going to be making some noise to have himself in Cincinnati. You and I have talked about how we don't think the Reds are going to let him break camp with the team, how we think
it's an outside chance, but yeah,
we think he's going to go to Louisville for a hot minute before he comes to Cincinnati. So the stars are starting to align because he'll already be on the 40-man roster. They send him to AAA for quote unquote, air quotes, whatever you want to do, seasoning to learn to play some other position that he doesn't learn to play.
Get a little paprika in there. Yeah.
Something. And then he's going to be in Cincinnati. I think by Memorial Day, by the end of May, I think Elly De La Cruz makes his way to the big league club. it's great. He's already on the 40-man roster. They're not going to have to make any wonky moves to get him there other than to free up a spot on the 26-man roster, which shouldn't be that hard to do. And who knows, by May, probably there will be an injury that clears a space anyway. So I like the way this is lining up for Elly. I think that it's, not that he needs motivation, not that he needs anything else to push him along, but he can see it too. If we can see it, he can see it. And he can see a clear path to Cincinnati developing before his very eyes.
Because he's just been so good at every single level. And it's a no-brainer. Obviously, he's going to get added to the 40-man roster. A couple other guys, Noelvi Marte, no-brainer. It's time for him to be added. He's going to get added. Brandon Williamson and Levi Stout, two guys that the Reds got in that same deal with Noelvi Marte. I look at them and I say that probably for the same line as Elly De La Cruz, this is just kind of the first step to them being on the Major League roster this year. I think both guys at some point will be up in Cincinnati. Now, I don't think that either of them will break camp with the team because Brandon Williamson, the more that I look at the way that he finished last season, it was a struggle for him, not something that I think he's going to just completely erase in spring training. So I think he's still going to need some time at AAA. And then Levi Stout as well. He pitched mostly at AA last year, so I think he's going to need some time at AAA. But again, adding them to the 40-man roster now helps that call-up that's going to happen later this year.
I absolutely agree with you on Levi Stout. Judging by his numbers and what we saw of him last season, I think he needs just a little bit more time. I think if he had been remotely close to being ready in 2022, we would have seen him given all of the injuries. Here is your hot take of the day, Jeff. I'm going to disagree with you on Brandon Williamson. He will break camp with the team and be the number 5 starter. As you know, when a season opens, they don't generally need a number 5 for the first 2 or 3 weeks because of the extra off days built into the calendar. So I think while he might not be on the 26-man roster for the first 2 weeks or so, he won't pitch anywhere else. He'll be the number 5 guy when they need a number 5 guy. That's my hot take of the day.
It's not bad. I don't mind that. And I always forget that too, because you think, okay, the 26-man roster is what it is from opening day through the first month of the season. That's not the case because you're right. There's not going to be a situation where they need that number 5 starter right away. But that's interesting. I don't tend to agree, but again, we could be convinced otherwise. Now, there are some dudes, and kind of want to spend a few minutes talking about them as well, that need whether they need to be added or whether the Reds could gamble with not adding them and keeping them. We do a little bit of discussing about. I will shout out a friend of the podcast, Doug Gray, has a couple of good articles over at redlegnation.com talking about some dudes who there is a discussion about whether or not they should be added to the 40-man roster to protect and what it would mean both ways. And I appreciate the articles that he had up there. They're very informative. And we're going to start first off with a guy that we've talked about a lot because I love to say his name, and that's Daniel Veoheen, and whether or not he should be added to the 40-man roster. And it's going to start with a pretty obvious reason as to why he should be.
There's nobody else to catch the baseball. They have to keep somebody. And listen, if they don't put Veoheen on the 40-man roster, someone might take a flyer on him just to get him in their organization. Now, let's be clear about the rules surrounding the Rule 5 draft. If you take a guy in the Rule 5 draft, he has to be on your active roster. Yes, for the entire season. Not your minors. He has to play on your major league roster for the entire season or be returned. Yes. So I think that could factor in. Now, Veoheen's offensive performance in 2022 doesn't scream, hey, I'm ready for the major leagues. But, a team that already knows heading in that they're completely out of it, maybe they just take a flyer and stick this guy on their roster as the backup catcher in order to get him for 2 or 3 years from now. So just because he's not ready doesn't necessarily mean another team might not take him.
And that's why Chucky Robinson, we label him as the emergency catcher. He's not on the 40-man roster, but he'll be in AAA. So you would have to make a 40-man roster move to call him up. Yeah, I agree. As far as catchers go, he is the only prospect in the Reds organization that needs to be added to the 40-man roster to protect him from the Rule 5 draft. Matt Nelson's not there. Logan Tanner's not there. So it's just him. So I think that he gets added and he'll be the fifth guy that the Reds need to make a move off the 40-man roster, because the 40-man roster is currently of 40 guys. So they have to basically cut at least 5 guys right now. Now, there is a group of guys past this point who, one of them, at least according to MLB Pipeline, is a top 30 prospect. And I did check, Baseball America has him as a top 30 prospect within the Reds organization as well. That Doug is a little bit ambivalent about whether or not the Reds should add him. That's Ivan Johnson, who has played some second base. He's also played some shortstop and things like that, but his hitting numbers have been very up or down, very hit or miss. Pun intended. But when you look at Ivan Johnson, he's not necessarily a just obvious add to the 40-man roster because he's still kind of young. He's not necessarily within the age range that he's an obvious major leaguer, and could be a dude that nobody looks at and says, okay, we're going to keep him on our roster all year long.
After those guys we talk about, when we reach this tier, Jeff, there's a couple other important things to remember. Right now, the 40-man roster is full. Yes. Every single one of these players to be added to the 40-man roster, somebody else is going to have to be removed. Now, there's a couple easy ones, and we're going to dig into this really deep tomorrow. Yeah. But there's some easy ones because some guys will eventually be transferred back to the 60-day IL. But it gets problematic when you get to this level because, when you talk about a prospect that's ranked that high, you would think in normal circumstances, Ivan Johnson would be a no-brainer. That's a fairly highly ranked prospect within the organization, but you've reached a level now where there's so many talented young guys that hard choices are going to have to be made. And I think a question that you'd have to ask yourself here is Ivan Johnson showing right now that he's good enough that a team would put him on the active roster to have him around 3 or 4 years around? And I don't think he is. I think this is a player that the Reds could risk exposing to the draft, to the Rule 5 draft, because I don't think somebody's going to tie up an active roster spot with him.
And he's shown power. He has a good power tool to his game. Yeah. I don't know why I just thought of that. But yeah, he's a pretty solid toolsy player. It's just he hasn't quite put it all together just yet. There's a couple of other guys. Nick Northcutt, who was the player to be named later in the Tommy Pham deal from Mason High School. I don't have a local angle to this. Steve says I do. I really don't care one way or the other what high school he went to. It's just what value does he bring to the team? And then 2 outfielders in TJ Hopkins and Isaiah Gilliam. I look at those guys and I say, between Northcutt, Hopkins, and Gilliam, I don't think they get added because of what you said. They have to make another 40-man move, which would be to cut a guy who probably would give the Reds value on their 40-man roster as opposed to having one of these guys on there.
I think the Reds internally have already made the decision to protect Northcutt, and I'm going to tell you why.
Oh, okay.
Northcutt came over as the player to be named later in the Tommy Pham deal. That wasn't announced till I think the end of the season.
It was after the minor league season was over.
After it was all over, they went out and brought Northcutt in to complete that trade. Now, I don't believe that they pick him to come over as a player to be named later with no chance to watch him play if they hadn't already reached a decision for him to be added to the 40-man roster and keep him around. Northcutt hit 30 home runs combined between 2 levels of the Red Sox minor league system in 2022. I think they like his power. I think they like his potential. And I just don't see that they would have picked him to be the guy to come over without any chance of keeping him. And 30 bombs between 2 levels, someone might take a flyer on him and pick him in the draft. Again, I think it comes down to when we reach this level, whether or not we think these guys are good enough to take up somebody's active roster spot. And Northcutt has shown power, but he's also still a very high strikeout guy. So maybe that keeps him off the 40-man roster. I think if the Reds feel like someone's going to take him, though, I think they add him. I think they made that decision already.
So kind of as we look at it, we're thinking about 6 guys need to be added to the 40-man roster, which means there need to be 6 cuts. We are going to dive into that very heavily on tomorrow's episode. The guys who will no longer be on the Reds 40-man roster, whether that's, they'll be put on waivers once they're cut off the 40-man roster, and whether or not they stay within the organization is not up to the Reds, but they will no longer be there on the 40-man. We'll jump into that tomorrow, though. But as for right now, let's take a look at a few more players the Reds could add to the roster via free agency. 2 are former Reds, and 1 is a former Dodger. We'll tell you who they are coming up next. But first, today's podcast is sponsored by BetOnline. And Steve, speaking of free agency, they've got some odds over at BetOnline for Jacob deGrom's next team. And I am surprised to learn that the Reds are not on this list. But they actually have the Dodgers at the top. Dodgers are the favorites, although they're only slightly ahead of the Atlanta Braves. Can you imagine the slight to Mets fans of Jacob deGrom going from New York to Atlanta? That would be chaos, and I think I'd be here for that.
And I think it's become the lazy odds makers way to just list the Dodgers first for everybody. Like,
why not?
Is that player any good at all? It's the Dodgers. But beyond that, I think DeGrom's got some interesting choices to make. I don't think it's going to be the Dodgers, actually. I'm going to go with the dark horse here at plus 750 and say that the San Diego Padres are going to go out and get DeGrom, because I really think San Diego is willing to do whatever it takes to stop being the stepchild in the National League West. And they want to win that division. They want to be not the also ran, not the honorable mention. They want to win it. And this is how they do it. They have to go out and get better than the Dodgers. And to do that, they're going to have to spend about $1 billion. So go get them.
I think I'm here for the Astros at plus 700, because the Astros, there was reports today that the Astros met with their general manager and with Dusty Baker about retaining them for one more year to try and get back-to-back champs. I think the Astros are trying to go full evil empire here. I think they go out and they get DeGrom and add him to the list, because Justin Verlander, I don't think is coming back, but they still have an amazing pitching staff without him. They get DeGrom, they've probably got the best pitching staff in the game. So I'd be very interested to see that and how it plays out. But I tell you what, if you want to check out some great odds and lines and stuff like that, head on over to betonline.net. Betonline.net has you covered every season with their in-depth articles, their news, their podcast, and all the great analysis on every team matchup that you can find. As always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information, with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport around. It's the fastest and easy way to check up on all your favorite games, whether you're talking about NFL, whether you're talking about college football. College basketball is back, baby, and I'm so happy to see how bad the UC Bearcats destroyed the Chaminade Silver Swords. Yeah, we're not going to jump into the absolute the level of talent there. But anyway, whatever, it's great to see college basketball back, plus hockey, MMA, all that great stuff. You can find it at betonline.net, because BetOnline is where the game starts. Thanks again for making Locked On Reds your first listen of the day. Coming up tomorrow, the Reds will have to move some players off the 40-man roster, and we'll tell you who that should be. Like we said, probably about 5 or 6 for sure. Maybe, I don't know that they get to 7, Steve, but there's definitely going to be some moves made, and we will dive into the players that they should be moving off the 40-man roster. But for now, let's look at a couple of free agents. Let's look at some guys that the Reds could pursue. 2 of the players we're going to talk about are former Reds, a couple of players that we've seen in the comments, and then one is a former Dodger, although really I think of him more as a Blue Jay, because he was only with the Dodgers for a hot minute last year. But we'll start with the former Reds, and the first guy we'll look at is Brandon Drury. We talk about him in the guise of, holy crap, it was great that the Reds got him for nothing at the end of spring training, and he just went off and turned into an asset that the Reds were able to cash in on. Could they do that again?
Well, they could, but I don't know that they should. Brandon Drury was a happy accident, Jeff. I mean, there's no other real way to put that.
Say it like he was a baby that the Reds had.
Well, he's Nick Kral's baby, let me tell you, because that's probably a great description. Here's the thing. He hit 22 home runs in the first half of the season before we traded him away to the San Diego Padres. During his time in San Diego, he was just slightly better than replacement level for them outside the friendly confines of Great American Ballpark. Is that because we changed his locale, because we changed his stadium, or did he really just kind of start naturally drifting back from his outlier position to the guy that he really is? I think that's more likely. I think he probably just started drifting back to the guy that he really is, which is maybe just a slightly above replacement level league average player. The number of dollars that he's going to command because he hit 30 home runs in the 2022 season combined between the two locations, I think makes him cost prohibitive. I think what would make sense for Cincinnati, if they could get him on the cheap, would be for him to platoon in the outfield with one of the F troop guys, and you make a whole outfielder out of the two. Either you combine him up with Fraley or you can bind him up with Friedel, but I just don't see that with the money that he's going to make, that he's a wise investment for the Reds, between the question marks and the fact that we wouldn't want him as a full-time player.
Right, and I think that the important part about his value last year was the fact that the Reds literally got him at league minimum. He got the vet minimum at $900K, and that's really what played into his trade value as well, was how well he played relative to how much money he was making, because the Padres only ended up spending like $350,000 on him through that trade. Now you're looking at a guy that's not only going to get a multi-year deal too, we forgot to mention that, but he's going to get around $6 million, at least according to Spot Track and their market value. So you're looking at $6-ish million for more than 1 year. That means that his trade value probably isn't that great, because he's not going to hit 22 home runs in the first half of this season. I'm pretty confident saying, he could prove me wrong, but I'm pretty sure he's not going to do that. So you're just, the value that the Reds extracted from him last year is not going to be there this year if they bring him back.
No, I agree with that. I think that just for all of the things we've just said, he won't be back in Cincinnati. But there's another guy, Jeff, that was fairly popular, that was really considered a great find, a good deal for the team when he came over from Cleveland, and that was Tyler Naquin. And, he made $4 million last year. He played well against right-handed pitching. And he's another guy that you would have to build a platoon around. Here's the problem is we've already got two guys just like him. We've got Jake Fraley. We've got TJ Friedel. There's just not room for a happy, warm, and fuzzy Naquin reunion. I think he would be too expensive. You have basically the same player in Friedel for a whole lot less money. I think the Reds roll with what they got in this situation.
Yeah, this is a situation where you're just signing the same guy you've already got, and he's going to be more expensive. Now, he made $4 million last year. He's probably not going to make that this year, but still, probably around $3 million, and it may even be a multi-year deal. There might be some teams out there that try to lock him up for 2 or 3 years, and the Reds just aren't going to do that, and they shouldn't do that because, again, they've got that guy. They've got Jake Fraley. Jake Fraley is Tyler Naquin. That's what he is, and I think that we romanticize Tyler Naquin because we saw him do some clutch things, and Jake Fraley really didn't have a chance to do clutch things because the Reds didn't really have any situations where they needed to be clutch in last year. So I think we got to look at this and say that Tyler Naquin and Jake Fraley are the same guy. And you could even make an argument for Friedel or Fairchild that they're the same guys, if not even slightly better than where Tyler Naquin is. So, yeah, I'm not interested in bringing him back. I'm thankful for the plays that he made, but overall, that's not a guy that I'm interested in. Now, there is a guy that's interesting to me, Steve, but not again, this isn't a move that's going to excite anybody, and we'll tell you exactly why, but the Reds could look at Kevin Pillar as an outfield platoon type guy, because he would fit in. He's a right-handed hitter that would fit in with the rest of the F troop, and he probably is going to be cheaper than Tyler Naquin. In fact, Kevin Pillar might be one of those guys that hangs out until spring training. You can get him on a vet minimum.
Oh, and this is a guy, look, we talked about going out and finding the next Drury, Tommy Pham, guy that you could get on a 1-year prove it deal that you could flip at the break if they're doing well. This guy really fits that bill. He's a career OPS plus that's slightly below league average at 88, but coming off a year where he only played 4 games, I think he's our guy. I think you go out and get a righty like this that really wants to prove it, and you put them in a bandbox to hit so that their numbers are going to be inflated. And then you flip them to the unsuspecting Dodgers or the unsuspecting Mets or Yankees or Padres or whoever is willing to pay, and you get big return. I think this is where Nick Krall is going to start establishing himself as a good general manager, is signing guys like this and flipping them low risk, high return, high reward type players. And I think Pilar fits that bill.
And he is a guy that teams have experience acquiring. Like after he played the first handful of years of his career with Toronto, they flipped him to San Francisco for some prospects, and he played well in San Francisco. And he's had a couple of years where he has been that, guy that everybody's talking about at the deadline. I think of him like Jeff Suppan, right? He's the guy that always gets traded to somebody who is in contention at the deadline. Kevin Pilar could be the Reds' Jeff Suppan this year, at least in the field. He doesn't pitch. Jeff Suppan pitched. Anyway,
hey, you never know with this team. He very well could pitch. Let's not just say that like it's a foregone conclusion, Jeffrey, because there's a lot of guys. I'm looking at Baseball Reference right now, and there's a lot of guys on this pitchers list that I guarantee you didn't think they were going to be on the pitchers list heading into 2022.
It was very clear the Reds missed Alex Blandino last year. I will say that. I will agree. Yeah.
Listen, Jeff, the Reds are going to have options to explore. I think that's really the key takeaway from this whole deal. There's not going to be flashy. They're not going to be big name press conferences, but there's dudes out there that can help this team be better. God, please make this team better than it was in 2022. Coming up, we're going to be talking about how the Reds will fare or could fare in the new lottery draft. Major League Baseball announced how that is going to work. And coming up right after this, we are going to take a look at the draft lottery and where the Reds stand. You can follow the podcast on all platforms, including YouTube. If you're watching us there, thank you so much. If it's your first time, make sure you click that subscribe button and the notification bell. Got to hit both of those. You'll get notified every single time we post anything, schedule a premiere, or go live. We're trying to do a lot of those lives. They are so much fun, and we want to talk baseball with you, so click those buttons. You can also follow us on Twitter when you are not watching the show. You can follow Jeff at Jeff Carr. That's Jeff with 3 Fs. You can follow me at S. Offenbaker. There's only 2 Fs in that because it is spelled correctly. And you can also follow the show at Locked On Reds. All right, Jeff, the draft lottery. When this first started being discussed, I was like, it's not a big deal. Whatever. It doesn't move the needle all that much. But that was in the context of the bigger financial picture that caused that ridiculous, dumb lockout to start the season and made me miss opening day and all kinds of things. I'm still ticked off about that. But yeah, now that we're actually in it, this is a big deal because this is how it's going to go down. Major League Baseball has announced that they are going to have the draft lottery. They're going to do the draws, so to speak, December 6th at the winter meetings. That's going to happen at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. You'll be able to watch it live on MLB Network. And they also released the percentage chances that each team has to get the number 1 draft pick. And the way it's going to work is this: picks 1 through 18 are going to be conducted lottery style. They're going to draw picks 1 through 18. Pick 19 through 30 is set already. They're using the order of finish in the playoffs to set 19 through 30. So, for example, the Houston Astros, they won the World Series. They finished the playoffs. That means they're picking last. No matter how many trash cans they bang in the dugout, they are picking last. So that brings us back to 1 through 18. The teams with the best odds are the Nationals, the A's, and the Pirates, Jeff. They are a whopping 16.5% chance of drawing the number 1 draft pick. Now, in 4th place, just a little bit behind that, is our Cincinnati Reds. They have a 13.2% chance of getting the number 1 draft pick. And then just behind the Reds are the Royals at 10%. Now, those are all of the teams with a 10% chance or better of securing the number one draft pick in this draft lottery. So I ask you, now that we've had some time to kind of think about this draft lottery and think about how it impacts the team, how do we feel about moving to a draft lottery? How do we feel about the Reds' chances? What are we thinking here?
I do like a draft lottery. I don't think it does what Rob Manfred said it was going to do, and it eliminates the need for tanking. People are still going to be like, well, I want the best shot to get the number one pick that I can if I don't think that I'm anywhere near a wild card spot. And honestly, I kind of look at this and I say, does this really make us that happy that the Reds missed out on last place? Because, at this point, I don't care that they're fourth place. I kind of wish they had a 16.5% chance of getting, I believe it's Dylan Cruz, who a lot of people have as the number one pick. I want the number one pick if we're not going to be in the playoffs.
Here's the problem I have with this. The Reds have a 13.2% chance to get the number one draft pick, but they could also get the 18th draft pick. Now, that is entirely possible that they end up at number 18. I have a problem with that. This model, let's just call it what it is. This model is copycat based on the NBA. The NBA does things this way, but you can't do that. And this is where the leadership of Major League Baseball and Rob Manfred just absolutely just confound me on a pretty regular basis, because I don't think he really understands the sport he's been hired to direct. Major League Baseball's number one draft pick never goes straight to the active roster. They are not impact players. They could be impact players years from now, maybe, if they make it, if they're not a miss, if they don't have injury problems. I'm looking at Nick Senzel. You never know how it's going to work out. In the NBA, that number one draft pick can play tomorrow, can play for the big club, can start on opening night the very next day. Baseball is not that way. And so I think it's flawed right out of the gate. And I don't like the impacts that are potentially far greater than the reward you might get out of having a higher draft position that may or may not make it anyway.
And I guess that's probably where he's like, well, see, that's why there's no incentive to losing, because you could conceivably have the worst record and have the 8th pick in the draft or something like that. But then you're not really, I don't know. I don't think it's a good way to conduct the MLB draft. Plus, it's shown in years past that there's a gratuitous drop from the top 3 or 4 picks to the next 4 or 5 picks, really, as far as the chances of that player making an impact. And we're talking about an impact, not just making the major leagues, because even that in and of itself is difficult for anybody in the top, let alone anybody in this draft anywhere, but making an impact, because you're thinking you're getting a guy that can help change the course of your franchise. But as we've seen in the past, that's not always the case. So you do want the best shot at the number one draft pick, but again, you're not talking about an easy impact on your team. So I'm kind of with you. I think that this is an important thing for Major League Baseball to continue to monitor and evaluate, and not just say, hey, look, we did this thing, it's done, we're good.
Well, and here, let's tell the truth. Let's tell the listeners the truth, Jeff. I'm going to drop a truth bomb. Rob Manfred is talking about trying to prevent teams from tanking because Manfred Hates Baseball can't look in the camera and tell you what the real deal is. And the real deal is that the owners aren't trying because they're pocketing all of the TV money, and they don't care whether or not they win. They don't care whether or not you go. It doesn't matter to them at all whether or not you buy a ticket and go to the stadium, because they have made all of their money for the year before the first pitch is ever thrown. So these kind of things are pitched and proposed and hyped by Major League Baseball's executive committee people because they want to distract you from that fact, and they think you're not smart enough to figure it out. And I don't believe that. I think all of our listeners are smart enough that they understand this. Does that mean I'm not going to the ballpark? No, you guys know I fly all over the stinking country to go to these baseball games. I love going to the ballpark, and I'm going to continue to do that. But it's not because Rob Manfred fooled me. It's not because Bob Castellini and his produce stand tricked me into thinking that he's doing something that he's not. It's because I love the game and I love the sport. And, it just ticks me off when they think that they're so smart, because they're not.
And we are takey on a Tuesday. I love it. I love it. And I think that's where we should drop the bomb. That's where on that bombshell, it's time to end. Thank you all so much for watching, for listening this edition of the Locked On Reds podcast. Coming up tomorrow, Steve and I will get takey again with what the Reds should do as far as moving guys off of the 40-man roster to make room for the prospects they need to protect. That's coming up on tomorrow's podcast. Now, for today, go check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, as they've got you covered each and every day in 22 minutes or less with all of the biggest stories of the day in sports, plus instant reactions and big game recaps. And they've also got the take of the day. That's Locked On Sports Today, just like Locked On Reds. We're available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcast. Steve, there are moves that are about to be made for the Reds because they've got to get to protecting some prospects. So what's that mean for you and me?
That means, in spite of Manfred hates baseball, you and I are going to continue to figure out what's going on. We're going to continue to talk about what we think the Cincinnati Reds should do and what they shouldn't do. And we're going to help keep all of our listeners and viewers locked on Reds every single day.